At 58, Jerry Reed spent his days digging graves in the quiet Pennsylvania town of Millstone, and his nights reading beneath a flickering cemetery light. People laughed when they saw dirt on his boots and geology books in his hands. Professor Graves, they called him. One evening, wealthy developer Richard Whitmore smirked and told Jerry that no amount of reading could turn a shovel into a degree. Jerry said nothing. He simply closed his book. 18 months later, those same townspeople would watch him walk into a packed courtroom in a dark suit. Then the judge would say 2 words no one expected: expert witness. And Jerry was about to reveal what had been buried beneath their town. If you have ever been underestimated because of where you stood in life, stay with Jerry's story. 2 years before the courtroom fell silent at the sight of Jerry Reed, he was still living in Philadelphia, surrounded by a life that seemed ordinary from the outside and fragile from within. At 56, Jerry worked as a laboratory technician in the geology department of a community college. The job was not glamorous, but he loved it. He prepared rock samples, maintained equipment labeled soil cores, cleaned instruments, and helped professors organize materials before classes. He had always been curious about the earth beneath people's feet. While other men his age talked about retirement, Jerry spent evenings taking part-time courses toward a degree in environmental science. It had taken him years to get that far. Money had always been tight. Jerry and his wife Linda had raised their daughter Rachel, carefully stretching every paycheck and postponing nearly every dream that belonged only to themselves. Still, Linda never complained when Jerry enrolled in another evening class. "You come home tired," she once told him, "but when you talk about what you learned, you don't look tired anymore." Jerry had smiled at that. He had imagined finishing his degree before 60. Maybe he would work in environmental testing. Maybe he would finally earn enough for Linda to stop worrying about medical bills, car repairs, and whether the refrigerator would survive another year. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. Linda collapsed in their kitchen. Jerry heard a glass shatter before he saw her on the floor. By the time the ambulance arrived, Linda could barely speak. The doctors told Jerry she had suffered a severe stroke. For the next several months, Jerry's entire life became a cycle of hospital corridors, rehabilitation appointments, medication schedules, insurance forms, and nights spent sitting beside Linda's bed. His textbooks remained unopened. At first, Jerry believed he was only taking 1 semester away from school. Then 1 semester became another. He withdrew from his courses completely. The savings he and Linda had built over decades disappeared with frightening speed. There were treatments insurance did not fully cover. There was home equipment. There were transportation expenses. There were bills Jerry opened at the kitchen table and sometimes stared at for 10 minutes before finding the courage to read the total. Rachel, who was living in Baltimore and raising her young son alone, tried to help. "Dad, let me send something." "No, you can't keep doing everything yourself." I said no. Rachel. Jerry was never angry at her. He was angry at the situation. He knew Rachel already worried about rent, childcare, and keeping her own household steady. Accepting money from her felt like passing his pain to the next generation. Linda understood him better than anyone. One evening, when Jerry was helping her sit upright, she studied his face. "You stopped school?" Jerry avoided her eyes. "For now." "Jerry, I'll go back." Linda did not argue. Her left hand had lost much of its strength, but she reached for his anyway. "You better." Jerry smiled because he knew she wanted him to. But inside, he already understood the truth. If Linda needed him, nothing else mattered. She died 8 months after the stroke, the morning after the funeral. Jerry woke before sunrise and reached toward her side of the bed without thinking. His hand touched an empty sheet. For several seconds, he could not remember why she was not there. Then memory returned. The pain was so sharp he sat on the edge of the bed and bent forward, unable to breathe normally. Philadelphia had once felt crowded and alive. After Linda died, it became unbearably empty. Jerry returned to work because he needed income, and because sitting alone in the apartment was worse. But grief followed him everywhere. He would see a piece of quartz under laboratory light and remember Linda teasing him for explaining mineral structures during dinner. He would pass a bakery she liked and automatically turn toward the door before remembering there was no reason to buy her anything. Then another blow arrived. The college announced a departmental restructuring. Positions were consolidated. Budgets were cut. Jerry's laboratory role was eliminated. His supervisor looked genuinely ashamed when he told him, "I'm sorry, Jerry. This wasn't my decision." Jerry nodded. He had heard enough explanations in hospitals, insurance offices, and billing departments to know that apologies could be sincere and still change nothing. At 56, he had no wife, no degree, almost no savings, and now no job. Rachel drove from Baltimore the following weekend. She found her father sitting among boxes in the apartment. "Come live with me," she said. Jerry shook his head. "Dad, there's room. You and Caleb need your space. You're my father, and you're my daughter. That's exactly why I'm not moving in." Rachel stared at him. "You think needing people makes you weak? No. Yes, you do." Jerry looked away. The truth was more complicated. He did not fear weakness. He feared becoming another responsibility for someone he loved. He had spent months watching Linda lose control over her own body. He had watched pride become pain whenever she needed help standing, bathing, or eating. Jerry could not bear the idea of becoming another weight Rachel had to carry, so he made a different decision. He returned to Millstone, Pennsylvania. His late grandfather had lived there decades earlier, and Jerry still remembered childhood summers among narrow roads, wooded hills, and old stone churches. Millstone had changed, but not much. It was the kind of town where people knew who had been married, divorced, arrested, promoted, or buried before the news reached the newspaper. Work was scarce. Jerry applied everywhere. Warehouse positions, maintenance jobs, hardware stores, landscaping crews. At his age, without a completed degree, and with a work history that did not fit neatly into available jobs, opportunities disappeared quickly. Finally, Evergreen Cemetery hired him. The work included maintaining the grounds, repairing markers, clearing brush, preparing burial plots, and digging graves. The salary was modest. The cemetery provided a small caretaker's cottage near the edge of the property. Jerry accepted. The cottage leaned slightly toward one side. Its roof leaked near the kitchen. One bedroom window refused to close completely. At night, wind passed through the frame with a thin whistle. Yet for the first time in months, Jerry had somewhere he could afford. Philadelphia had represented the life he thought he was building. Millstone represented what remained after that life collapsed. During his first week, Jerry unpacked boxes he had barely touched since Linda's death. Clothes, photographs, old receipts, a ceramic mug Rachel had made in elementary school. Then he found a small envelope tucked between two of Linda's books. His name was written across the front. Jerry sat down before opening it. Inside was a short handwritten note. Linda had written long before her stroke. She told him how proud she was that he kept studying after long work days. She told him that curiosity was one of the things she loved most about him. At the bottom, she had written a simple sentence: "Don't stop learning because life gets hard." Jerry read it twice, then a third time. His eyes filled. For months, he had believed losing school meant losing the person he was trying to become. That night, he carried one of his old geology textbooks outside. The cemetery was silent. A maintenance light above the shed cast a pale circle over a wooden bench. Jerry sat beneath it and opened the book. He had no classroom, no professor, no tuition money, no guarantee he would ever earn a degree. But he still had his mind, and for the first time since Linda died, Jerry Reed began to feel that something inside him had not been buried. Within 3 months, Jerry Reed's evenings at Evergreen Cemetery had become as disciplined as the life he once lived in Philadelphia. He rose before sunrise, brewed cheap coffee in the caretaker's cottage, and crossed the damp grass while morning fog still rested between the headstones. His days belonged to physical labor. He trimmed weeds, repaired damaged markers, cleared fallen branches, prepared burial plots, and filled graves after families had gone home. By sunset, his shoulders often ached. His hands were rougher than they had been in the laboratory, but every evening Jerry washed the soil from his arms, ate a simple dinner, and carried a book beneath the maintenance light. Learning became his private ritual. Margaret Collins, a 72-year-old retired librarian who volunteered several mornings each week at Millstone Public Library, helped him obtain books through interlibrary loans. Jerry began with subjects he already understood from his former laboratory work. Soon, however, his curiosity expanded. Groundwater movement, stratigraphy, soil compaction, erosion, forensic taphonomy, burial disturbance. He studied how water traveled differently through clay, sand, gravel, and fractured rock. He learned how excavation changed the density of soil, and how disturbed earth could sometimes be identified decades later. Jerry filled inexpensive notebooks with diagrams and observations. Margaret noticed immediately that he was different from most casual readers. "You're taking notes on the footnotes," she said one afternoon. Jerry smiled. "Sometimes that's where the interesting questions are." Margaret studied him for a moment. "You should have been a professor." Jerry shook his head. "I'm a gravedigger." That wasn't what I said. The distinction stayed with him. Not everyone in Millstone viewed Jerry's studying with Margaret's respect. People had begun noticing the books. At first, the jokes were mild. A delivery driver once asked Jerry whether he planned to interview the dead. Someone else joked that he must be studying instructions for digging straighter holes. Jerry laughed along when he could. Then the nickname appeared, Professor Graves. It followed him from the cemetery into town. One Saturday morning, Jerry stopped at Maggie's diner after repairing a damaged headstone. Dirt remained beneath his fingernails, and a thick geology textbook rested beside his coffee. 3 men at the counter noticed it. "Careful," one said loudly. "Professor Graves is doing research." Another man laughed. "What are you studying today?" Jerry advanced shovel theory. Jerry kept reading. He had discovered years earlier that mockery often became boring when nobody fought back. Then the diner door opened. Richard Whitmore entered. At 51, Richard looked like the kind of man Millstone considered successful before he ever spoke. His tailored jacket, expensive watch-polished shoes, and confident smile separated him immediately from the farmers and mechanics sitting at the counter. Whitmore Development had transformed him into one of the wealthiest men in the county. Richard understood the influence wealth gave him, and he enjoyed it. He noticed Jerry's book. "So this is Professor Graves." The men laughed. Jerry closed the book gently. "Morning, Mr. Whitmore." Richard picked it up before Jerry could stop him. "Soil hydrology." He glanced at several pages. "Looks expensive? Used copy?" Richard placed it down. "You know, Jerry, reading books is admirable, but eventually a man has to understand what he is." The diner became quieter. Jerry looked at him. "And what am I?" Richard smiled. "A man with a shovel." Several people laughed again. Jerry felt humiliation rise inside him, but he refused to give Richard the reaction he wanted. He opened the textbook. Richard walked away. What Jerry did not know was that Richard Whitmore would soon give him a reason to study that book more carefully than ever. Several weeks later, Whitmore Development announced Pinecrest Estates. The project would transform 80 acres of wooded land beside Evergreen Cemetery into luxury homes overlooking Millstone Valley. The announcement divided the town. Some residents worried about traffic and environmental damage. Others celebrated the jobs and increased property values. Richard promised Pinecrest would represent Millstone's future. Construction began quickly. Jerry watched bulldozers strip vegetation from the ridge beyond the cemetery's northern boundary. Then he noticed survey stakes. Several appeared unusually close to an older wooded portion of Evergreen. Jerry knew the cemetery boundaries because maintaining them was part of his job. One afternoon, he approached cemetery administrator Thomas Keller. "Those survey markers look close." Thomas barely glanced up from his desk. "Whitmore's people know what they're doing. I think one may be inside cemetery property." Thomas sighed. You're measuring land, now I'm asking a question. Then ask fewer. Jerry stiffened. Thomas leaned back. Richard Whitmore has engineers, surveyors, environmental consultants, lawyers. You dig graves. Let professionals worry about Pinecrest. Jerry left without arguing. But the remark bothered him. That evening, instead of studying beneath the maintenance light, Jerry walked toward the northern boundary. Heavy equipment had exposed a wide section of hillside. Jerry crouched near the fence. Something looked wrong. Years of laboratory work had taught him to notice patterns. Natural soil formed histories. Layers developed through weather, erosion, vegetation, minerals, and time. The exposed hillside should have reflected the geology Jerry had been studying in county maps, dense clay above weathered shale. Instead, he saw irregular layers, brown earth, then gray material, then another band of brown. Small pieces of crushed brick appeared where no building should ever have stood. Jerry picked up a fragment. He did not jump to conclusions. That was one lesson science had taught him. Observation came before explanation. The next morning, Jerry visited Millstone Public Library. Margaret was shelving books when he approached. You have county geological surveys? She smiled. Good morning to you, too. Sorry, you look like you haven't slept. I found something. Together, they located old geological maps and archived land records. Jerry compared them with publicly available documents describing Pinecrest Estates. Whitmore Development's environmental report described the ridge as largely undisturbed native soil. Jerry read that sentence twice. Then he remembered the crushed brick. Undisturbed soil did not contain construction debris. Margaret watched his expression change. What is it I don't know yet? That answer was honest. Jerry returned to the cemetery and began paying closer attention. He noticed trucks entering Pinecrest carrying loads of soil. He noticed drainage trenches being cut along the ridge. He noticed that after small rains, water appeared in cemetery areas that had previously remained dry. Jerry recorded everything in a notebook: dates, locations, weather, changes in soil. He told no one except Margaret, not because he believed a crime had occurred. Not yet. He simply wanted facts. One evening, Richard Whitmore's truck stopped near the cemetery entrance. Richard stepped out and noticed Jerry examining soil near the boundary. What are you doing working? With a notebook. Jerry stood. I keep maintenance records. Richard glanced toward the exposed ridge. For less than a second, something changed in his expression. Jerry saw it. Then Richard smiled. You really do enjoy pretending to be a scientist. Jerry wiped soil from his hands. I enjoy understanding what I'm looking at. Richard stepped closer. Understanding can be dangerous when a man doesn't know enough. Jerry met his eyes. And ignorance, Richard's smile vanished. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then, Richard returned to his truck. Jerry watched him drive towards Pinecrest. Above the ridge, dark clouds were gathering. The weather forecast predicted heavy rain. Jerry looked at the newly cut drainage channels and then toward the old graves below. Something in his stomach tightened. He could not yet explain what was wrong with the hillside. But he knew one thing. The ground beside Evergreen Cemetery was not behaving naturally, and the storm coming toward Millstone was about to reveal why. The storm reached Millstone shortly after midnight. Jerry Reed woke to rain hammering the roof of the caretaker's cottage. For several seconds he remained beneath the blanket listening. He had experienced plenty of storms since moving to Evergreen Cemetery, but this one sounded different. Water was not simply falling, it was moving. Jerry dressed quickly, pulled on his work boots, and raincoat, grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. Cold rain struck his face. Across the cemetery, water streamed between headstones in narrow, muddy channels. Jerry aimed his flashlight toward the northern slope. His stomach tightened. The runoff was coming from Pinecrest Estates. Before construction began, thick vegetation on the ridge had absorbed and slowed rainfall. Now much of that vegetation was gone. Bare earth and newly excavated drainage trenches were directing enormous quantities of water downhill, straight toward Evergreen Cemetery. Jerry ran. Near the oldest burial section, water had collected around several graves. One headstone was leaning dangerously. Jerry grabbed a shovel from the maintenance shed and began digging channels to redirect the runoff. For hours he worked alone. Water filled his boots, mud covered his pants. His shoulders burned as he moved sandbags, cleared blocked drains, and tried to prevent water from washing away more soil. Around 3 in the morning, he heard something collapse. Jerry turned. A section of earth beside an older grave had sunk several inches. No. He hurried toward it. The grave itself remained intact, but the surrounding soil was saturated. Jerry understood immediately that this was not normal surface runoff. Water appeared to be moving beneath the ground as well. He crouched and aimed his flashlight into a shallow channel. Something caught his attention. The sediment was almost black. Jerry scooped a small amount into his gloved hand. Under the flashlight, it appeared black, gray, greasy, in places unlike the reddish-brown clay typical of the ridge. Then he noticed the smell. Metallic. Chemical. Jerry brought the flashlight closer. Tiny fragments were mixed through the material. Some looked like corroded metal. Others resembled burned industrial debris. He remembered the strange layers exposed at Pinecrest: crushed brick, gray fill, foreign material where native clay and shale should have been. Jerry stood slowly. The water flowing through Evergreen was carrying something from the construction site. He took out his phone. He photographed the sediment, then the drainage channel, then the slope above it. Jerry knew photographs alone could be misunderstood, so he returned to the maintenance shed and retrieved his notebook. Sample bags, measuring tape, and marking flags. The rain continued. Jerry recorded everything he could observe without entering Whitmore Development's property. Time, weather conditions, location, estimated depth, color, texture, odor, direction of water movement. He marked 3 places where unusual sediment had accumulated. By sunrise, Jerry was exhausted. The storm weakened, leaving Evergreen covered in broken branches and standing water. Thomas Keller arrived shortly after 7. He stepped from his car and stared at the damage. What happened runoff from Pinecrest? Thomas looked toward the ridge. That was one hell of a storm. It wasn't only the storm. Jerry led him toward the northern section. Several grave markers had shifted. One burial plot had partially collapsed along its edge. Jerry pointed toward the dark sediment. Look at that. Thomas frowned. Looks like mud. It isn't native soil. Thomas glanced at Jerry. You know that from looking. I know what the soil here normally looks like. Jerry opened his notebook. The runoff started above the cemetery. Some of it is moving through disturbed fill. There's material mixed into it that shouldn't be there. Thomas's expression hardened. Jerry, smell it. I'm not smelling dirt. It has a chemical odor. Thomas looked toward Pinecrest again. Jerry noticed nervousness behind his irritation. I think we should report this. To whom? County Environmental Services. Maybe the state. Thomas laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Because dirty water came downhill during a storm. Because contaminated-looking sediment came downhill from a construction site. You don't know that it's contaminated, no. That's why someone qualified should test it. Thomas stepped closer. You're not an environmental inspector? I never said I was. Then stop behaving like one. Jerry felt anger rising. He controlled it. I'm responsible for maintaining these grounds. You're responsible for digging graves and cutting grass. Thomas pointed toward the damaged plots. Clean this up. Jerry stared at him. And the sediment. Dispose of it. Jerry's eyes narrowed. You don't want samples kept, no? Why? Thomas's face reddened. Because I'm your supervisor, Jerry. That answer told Jerry more than Thomas intended. Jerry closed his notebook. He spent the remainder of the morning repairing storm damage, but he did not throw away everything he had collected. He retained his photographs and written observations. 2 days later, a black SUV stopped outside the maintenance shed. Richard Whitmore stepped out. Jerry was repairing a wheelbarrow. Richard approached with an umbrella despite the clear sky. "Heard you had trouble during the storm." Jerry continued tightening a bolt. Several graves were damaged. Unfortunate. Most of the water came from Pinecrest. Richard's expression remained pleasant. "Rain runs down, so does whatever it carries." Silence. Richard looked toward the caretaker's cottage. "You live here, right, for now? Not much of a place. It's enough." Richard smiled. "I admire that." Jerry stood. "What do you want?" Richard removed an envelope from inside his jacket. "Construction causes inconveniences. We sometimes compensate neighboring properties for cleanup." Jerry did not take it. "Give it to the cemetery board. This is for you." Jerry looked at the envelope. "How much? 5,000? Jerry almost laughed. He earned less than that over many weeks of cemetery work. "For what cleanup?" "Your time, your cooperation." My cooperation with what Richard's smile thinned. Not turning ordinary storm damage into some dramatic environmental crusade. There it was. Jerry understood. "You know what washed down here." Richard's eyes hardened. "Be careful." Jerry remembered Maggie's diner, a man with a shovel. That was how Richard saw him. Poor enough to buy, uneducated enough to deceive, disposable enough to threaten. Jerry pushed the envelope back toward him. "Keep your money." Richard did not move. "Think carefully." I did. $5,000 could change things for someone in your position. Jerry looked towards the cottage. Months earlier, those words might have wounded him. Now they almost strengthened him. He thought of Linda, the hospital bills, his lost job, the empty apartment. He had already lost nearly everything he once believed gave him security. Richard Whitmore could not frighten him with poverty. "I know exactly what my position is," Jerry said. Richard slipped the envelope back into his jacket. Poor men sometimes mistake stubbornness for courage, and rich men sometimes mistake money for authority. Richard stared at him. Then, he walked away. The next morning, Jerry entered the cemetery office to update maintenance records. He opened the filing cabinet. The storm report was there, but several pages were missing. Jerry checked again. His earlier notes describing drainage changes near Pinecrest were gone. He searched another folder. Nothing. Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Lose something?" Jerry turned. "Some of my maintenance records are missing." Thomas shrugged. "Maybe you misplaced them." "I didn't." "Then write them again." Jerry studied his supervisor's face. For the first time, he stopped wondering whether Thomas was merely dismissive. Something deeper was happening. Jerry returned to the maintenance shed and opened his personal notebook. The original observations were still there. So were the photographs on his phone. He looked toward Pinecrest. Machines moved across the ridge as though nothing had happened. Jerry understood now that the strange soil was only part of the mystery. Someone was frightened enough to offer him money. Someone was frightened enough to remove records. And whatever they were trying to hide was buried somewhere beneath that hill. Jerry opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, he wrote the date. Then he began documenting everything. 6 weeks after the storm, the northern section of Evergreen Cemetery collapsed. Jerry Reed heard it before he saw it. He had been repairing a loose gate near the maintenance shed when a deep cracking sound rolled across the cemetery. It was followed by a dull, heavy collapse that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. Jerry dropped his wrench and ran. When he reached the northern slope, his heart sank. A section of ground nearly 30 feet wide had given way. 2 headstones had fallen sideways. Another leaned toward the exposed earth. Several graves had been damaged, and beneath the collapsed soil, Jerry could see part of an old stone retaining structure that had been hidden underground for decades. Families began arriving within an hour. Someone had posted photographs online. By noon, local reporters stood outside Evergreen's gates. Jerry worked desperately to stabilize the area, but he already understood what had happened. The soil was saturated beneath the surface. Water had continued moving downhill from Pinecrest Estates long after the storm. Thomas Keller arrived with members of the cemetery board. "What did you do?" Thomas demanded. Jerry stared at him. "What did I do? You excavated here last month." 40 feet from the collapse. Richard Whitmore appeared behind the board members. Jerry immediately understood. This was not an investigation. It was a performance. Richard examined the damaged graves with a solemn expression. "This is terrible." Jerry looked at him. Richard turned toward the board. "Our engineers warned that improper excavation near older retaining structures could destabilize soil." "That's not what happened," Jerry said. Everyone looked at him. "The groundwater changed after Pinecrest cut those drainage trenches. I documented it." Thomas shook his head. "You documented your theories." "They aren't theories." Water started appearing where it never appeared before. Richard sighed. "Jerry, you read a few books and suddenly think you understand civil engineering." Jerry felt the insult land exactly where Richard intended. But this time the stakes were no longer his pride. Families were staring at damaged graves. They needed someone to blame. Richard knew it. "You have my reports," Jerry said to Thomas. Thomas hesitated. "What reports?" Jerry stared at him. "The drainage observations, the storm records. I don't remember receiving anything like that." Jerry felt cold despite the afternoon heat. He finally understood why the pages had disappeared. By evening, the story had spread across Millstone. The next morning's local newspaper carried a photograph of the collapsed cemetery section, beneath a headline questioning whether improper grave excavation had caused the damage. Jerry's name appeared repeatedly. One sentence hurt more than the others. An untrained cemetery worker had reportedly performed excavation in the affected area. Untrained. Jerry read the word several times. Years in a geology laboratory meant nothing. Years of studying meant nothing. His notebooks meant nothing. To Millstone, he was simply the poor man with the shovel. At Maggie's diner, conversation stopped when he entered. Jerry ordered coffee. Two men near the window whispered loudly enough for him to hear. Professor Graves finally learned something. The other chuckled. "Books didn't teach him how to dig." Jerry left without touching his coffee. 3 days later, Thomas called him into the cemetery office. 2 board members were waiting. Jerry sat across from them. Thomas folded his hands. "Pending investigation, you're suspended. On what evidence several graves were damaged? I know that. You performed excavation nearby." "Every excavation I performed followed cemetery procedures." One board member avoided Jerry's eyes. Jerry looked at Thomas. "Show them my maintenance reports." Thomas remained silent. "The reports about Pinecrest drainage, we've already discussed this." "No. You denied they existed." Thomas's jaw tightened. Jerry understood there was nothing left to say. He stood. A week later, Evergreen Cemetery terminated his employment. The official letter cited negligence failure to follow maintenance protocols and unauthorized technical assessments beyond his assigned responsibilities. Jerry read it twice. Then he noticed another paragraph. Because the caretaker's cottage was tied to his employment, he had 14 days to vacate. Jerry sat alone at his kitchen table. For several minutes, he heard only the refrigerator humming. The feeling was painfully familiar. Linda's hospital room, the college restructuring, the apartment in Philadelphia. Every time Jerry rebuilt something, life seemed to reach down and remove another piece. He looked around the cottage. It was shabby. The roof leaked. The windows rattled. But it had become home. Now even that was being taken. Rachel arrived 2 days later. She found boxes covering the floor. "Come to Baltimore." Jerry continued packing. "Dad, I heard you. You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not proving anything." "Then stop doing this alone." Jerry finally looked at her. His daughter saw exhaustion in his face that frightened her. Please, she whispered. Jerry sat down. For the first time, he considered surrendering. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe Millstone was not worth fighting. Maybe Richard Whitmore had already won. Jerry could leave. Forget the cemetery, forget Pinecrest, forget the strange sediment and missing records. He was tired. Then someone knocked. Margaret Collins stood outside holding a cardboard box. I heard she said. Jerry stepped aside. Margaret placed the box on the table. What is this insurance? Jerry opened it. Inside were printed photographs, scanned notebook pages, copies of environmental reports, county maps, and several maintenance documents. Jerry stared at her. Margaret smiled faintly. You kept bringing things to the library, I know, and I kept scanning them. Why? Because people who remove records usually don't stop with the first copy. Jerry lifted one page. It was his drainage report. The report Thomas claimed never existed. Jerry felt something inside him change. Not hope exactly, something harder. Proof. Margaret pointed toward the documents. You weren't imagining what you saw. Jerry looked through the photographs. The black sediment, the exposed hillside, drainage channels, survey markers. Everything Richard and Thomas wanted forgotten remained inside that box. Rachel watched her father's expression. She knew immediately that Baltimore had just become less likely. Dad. Jerry looked at her. I can't leave yet. Rachel closed her eyes. You could lose everything. Jerry looked around the nearly empty cottage. I already did. 2 weeks later, Jerry moved into an abandoned hunting cabin several miles outside Millstone. The owner, an elderly acquaintance of Margaret's, agreed to rent it cheaply. The cabin stood at the end of a gravel road surrounded by woods. There was no reliable internet. The heating barely worked. At night, Jerry could hear wind moving through the trees. He found occasional landscaping jobs and cleaned old grave markers for families who remembered the care he had shown at Evergreen. The money barely covered food and rent, but the isolation gave him something he had not possessed in months, time. Jerry spread Margaret's copies across an old wooden table. He began comparing dates, storm records, county maps, construction filings, historic photographs. He did not trespass onto Pinecrest property. He did not confront Richard. He searched only publicly available information. Slowly, patterns emerged. Water had not begun flooding Evergreen randomly. The changes followed construction activity. Drainage channels appeared, then groundwater patterns shifted. Then contaminated-looking sediment emerged. Then the cemetery collapsed. Jerry pinned an old county map to the cabin wall. Something caught his attention. The land beneath Pinecrest had changed ownership several times. Jerry traced the parcels backward. 20 years? 30? 40? Then he stopped. One company name appeared on an old property record, Sterling Metal Works. Jerry had never heard of it. He wrote the name in his notebook. The next morning he called Margaret. Can you find anything about a company called Sterling Metal Works? There was silence while Margaret wrote it down. How old closed decades ago? What are you looking for? You looking for? Jerry stared at the maps covering the cabin wall. I don't know yet. That was still the truth. But Jerry no longer felt like the defeated man who had packed boxes inside the caretaker's cottage. Millstone believed it had removed a troublesome gravedigger. Richard believed poverty would force Jerry away. Thomas believed missing paperwork would erase the past. They had misunderstood him. Jerry Reed had spent years digging through earth. Now sitting alone in a forgotten cabin with Linda's note beside his books, he was learning how to dig through lies. And somewhere inside the history of Sterling Metal Works, he suspected he was about to find the first answer. Winter arrived early in the hills outside Millstone. By November, frost covered the windows of Jerry Reed's rented hunting cabin each morning, and cold air slipped through gaps in the wooden walls. The small heater worked when it wanted to. On the worst nights, Jerry wore his coat while studying. His life had become smaller than ever. He earned money wherever he could. Some days he cleared leaves or repaired fences. On others, he cleaned old grave markers for families who remembered how carefully he had treated their loved ones at Evergreen. Occasionally, contractors hired him for manual labor. The work barely paid enough. Yet Jerry kept studying. His books covered one side of the cabin table. Margaret's copied records covered the other. Then Margaret called him one afternoon. "I found someone you should meet." Jerry leaned against the kitchen counter. "Who? Dr. Rebecca Sullivan, forensic geologist. She teaches at a university about 2 hours from Millstone." Jerry almost laughed. "And why would she want to meet me? Because I sent her copies of your notes." Jerry straightened. "You did what only the material you gave me permission to copy, and she wants to talk." Jerry looked down at his work clothes. The idea made him unexpectedly nervous. People in Millstone mocked him for reading scientific books. Richard Whitmore had built an entire attack around Jerry's lack of credentials. Rebecca Sullivan possessed everything Jerry did not: degrees, academic standing, professional recognition. Still, he agreed. 3 days later, Jerry entered Rebecca's university office carrying 2 notebooks. She was in her late 40s, composed and direct, with shelves crowded by geological samples, journals, and field photographs. Rebecca offered him a chair. "I've read your observations." Jerry waited for the criticism. Instead, she asked, "Who taught you field documentation?" "No one, exactly. You worked in a laboratory community college geology department. For how long?" "Almost 12 years. Rebecca opened his notebook. "You recorded rainfall estimates, sediment color, texture, drainage direction, approximate depth, and location. I wrote down what I saw." "That is precisely why these notes are useful." Jerry looked surprised. "But I'm not a geologist." "No," Rebecca said. "And you shouldn't claim to be." Jerry appreciated the bluntness. She continued, "But not having a geology degree doesn't make your observations worthless." Rebecca pulled one of Jerry's photographs closer. "Tell me what you see here." "Disturbed fill." Why Jerry pointed. "The layers aren't consistent. Native soil around Millstone Ridge should be mostly clay above weathered shale. This has construction debris mixed through it. Could that happen naturally? No." "How confident are you that it's disturbed very? That I know why it's there?" "I'm not." Rebecca looked up. "Good." Jerry frowned. "Good you separate observation from conclusion. That matters." For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Jerry felt someone was evaluating what he knew rather than what title he lacked. Rebecca agreed to help him strengthen his methodology. She did not make things easy. She challenged him constantly. When Jerry made assumptions, she stopped him. When his terminology was imprecise, she corrected it. When he proposed explanations unsupported by evidence, she forced him to reconsider them. Jerry enrolled in legitimate online continuing education courses covering soil science, environmental sampling, groundwater behavior, and field documentation. He studied late into the night. Rebecca sometimes sent him unidentified soil photographs and asked him to describe what could and could not reasonably be concluded. Jerry made mistakes. At first, they embarrassed him. Rebecca refused to allow that. "If you're afraid of being wrong," she told him, "you'll eventually start pretending you're right." Jerry wrote the sentence in his notebook. Weeks passed. His thinking became sharper. So did his investigation. Meanwhile, Rachel continued calling. One evening, she drove from Baltimore and found Jerry surrounded by county records. "You look terrible." "Nice to see you too. I'm serious." Jerry smiled weakly. Rachel noticed Linda's handwritten note beside his books. She picked it up. "You still carry this around most days?" Rachel read the familiar words. Then she looked at him. "You know Mom never blamed you." "For what? For leaving school?" Jerry turned toward the window. "I should have finished earlier." "Dad, if I'd had the degree, maybe I wouldn't have lost the laboratory job. And if you had stayed in school when Mom got sick." Jerry said nothing. Rachel's voice softened. "You would have spent the rest of your life wishing you'd been beside her." Jerry stared at the dark woods. He had never allowed himself to say that aloud. "I failed at finishing something." No, you made a choice. It cost me. So did loving Mom. Jerry turned. Rachel's eyes were wet. That doesn't mean love was a mistake. The words broke through something Jerry had carried since Linda's death. For years he had treated his unfinished education like evidence against himself. Proof that he had almost become someone. Almost succeeded. Almost escaped financial insecurity. But Linda had never viewed him that way. Rachel did not either. Perhaps the failure existed mainly inside Jerry. After Rachel left, he sat alone beside the heater. He opened Linda's note. Don't stop learning because life gets hard. Jerry finally understood that she had never written anything about a diploma. She had written about learning. The distinction changed him. A week later, Margaret uncovered historical records about Sterling Metalworks. The company had operated on the ridge from the late 1960s until the early 1980s. Its business involved metal finishing and industrial components. Jerry immediately became interested. Facilities like that could have generated contaminated waste, depending on their processes and disposal practices. He searched county archives. The property had changed hands repeatedly after Sterling closed. Eventually, much of it was acquired by Whitmore Development. Jerry compared old aerial photographs with Pinecrest construction maps. Several former industrial areas overlapped directly with sections now being developed for expensive homes. Then he found the Environmental Remediation Report. According to documents filed before Pinecrest construction, contaminated material associated with the former industrial site had been excavated, removed, and transported to an approved disposal facility. Jerry read the report carefully. If that statement was accurate, the black-gray material flowing into Evergreen should not have existed. He called Rebecca. She asked him to bring everything. The next afternoon, they spread the records across a university conference table. Rebecca examined the remediation documents. You understand what you're suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet. Good. Jerry placed his photographs beside the historical map. But if contaminated soil was removed from these areas, why did material resembling industrial fill appear downhill? After construction, Rebecca studied the documents. There could be explanations. I know, imported fill could contain debris. Records could be incomplete. The material you photographed may not be hazardous. I know. Rebecca looked at him. Jerry continued. But there's another problem. He unfolded a county geological map. The remediation report describes soil beneath this section as sandy fill over native sandy subsoil. Rebecca leaned closer. Jerry pointed to the regional geological description. But this ridge isn't naturally sandy. Rebecca's expression changed. Clay and shale? Exactly. She pulled the report toward her. For several minutes, neither spoke. Jerry felt the same sensation he had experienced the night of the storm. Something did not fit. Rebecca finally said, "We need more documentation before drawing conclusions." Jerry nodded. He wanted evidence, not revenge. That distinction mattered. Over the following days, he compared historical aerial images, property boundaries, environmental filings, and construction records. Then he found another inconsistency. Several locations described as remediated appeared in later photographs to have been covered rather than deeply excavated. Jerry sat back. A possibility formed. What if the contaminated material had never been transported away? What if removing it had been too expensive? What if someone had simply covered it with imported fill and built Pinecrest above it? Jerry stared at the map. Evergreen Cemetery sat downhill. Groundwater moved downhill too. His eyes traveled from the former Sterling Metalworks property toward the graves damaged during the storm. Suddenly, the scattered pieces began forming one frightening picture. The unusual sediment, the altered drainage, Richard's money, Thomas's missing records, the cemetery collapse. Jerry did not yet possess proof. But he finally understood what he might be looking for. The secret beneath Pinecrest was not merely bad construction. Something from Millstone's industrial past might still be buried beneath the ridge. And if Jerry was right, the people living above it had no idea what was beneath their homes. Jerry Reed had learned one principle from Dr. Rebecca Sullivan that mattered more than any technical term in his notebooks. Suspicion was not evidence. By early spring, Jerry had accumulated enough suspicious details to fill an entire wall of his cabin. Historic photographs, property maps, drainage diagrams, environmental reports, and handwritten observations surrounded a large map of Pinecrest Estates. But Jerry refused to accuse Richard Whitmore publicly. Not yet. He and Rebecca used only records they could legally obtain. Then Jerry noticed something neither had seen before. He was comparing laboratory tables from Whitmore Development's environmental report when several numbers caught his attention. Jerry leaned closer. 3 soil samples supposedly collected from different areas contained identical testing values across multiple measurements. He called Rebecca. Could separate samples produce exactly the same numbers possibly? Why? How many identical values before it becomes strange? Rebecca asked him to send the pages. 20 minutes later, she called back. Her voice had changed. Where did you get these county planning records? These samples are listed as coming from different locations. I know. Rebecca paused. Identical results aren't automatically proof of fraud, but this degree of repetition deserves scrutiny. Jerry added the pages to his growing file. Then he returned to the soil descriptions. The environmental report repeatedly described layers of sandy native material beneath portions of Pinecrest. But Jerry had studied Millstone Ridge carefully. Its natural structure was dominated by dense clay and weathered shale. He drove to Rebecca's university office the next morning. She spread county geological surveys beside the Whitmore reports. Jerry pointed between them. This report says native sandy subsoil. Rebecca nodded. And the geological survey clay and shale. Could local variation explain it? Maybe in a small pocket, not across this much of the property. Rebecca looked at him. Jerry knew what she was thinking because he was thinking it too. If the sample descriptions were false, then the laboratory numbers might not represent the locations claimed in the report. Someone could have substituted samples or rewritten results. But possibility still was not proof. Then Millstone's problem moved beyond the cemetery. A Pinecrest homeowner named Daniel Brooks noticed that water from his kitchen faucet occasionally smelled metallic. Another family complained of brown discoloration in their private well. Within 2 weeks, 4 households had reported unusual water. Richard Whitmore responded quickly. He told residents that aging municipal infrastructure was likely responsible and promised Whitmore Development would cooperate fully. Then, a 9-year-old boy living in Pinecrest became seriously ill. Doctors could not immediately determine the cause, but testing raised concerns about prolonged exposure to contaminants. State environmental authorities were notified. Millstone changed overnight. The development once advertised as the town's bright future became surrounded by testing vehicles and frightened families. Jerry watched television coverage from his cabin. Parents stood outside expensive homes holding bottled water. He felt no satisfaction. Those people had trusted someone. Now their children might pay the price. His phone rang after midnight. Jerry. He recognized Thomas Keller immediately. Where are you doesn't matter. Thomas sounded frightened. I need to tell you something. Jerry sat upright. Then tell me. Silence. Finally, Thomas whispered, You were right about the drainage. Jerry gripped the phone. What did Whitmore do? He needed somewhere to move stormwater during construction. The original drainage plan was going to delay permits, so he asked me to approve temporary trenches across cemetery land. Jerry closed his eyes. You let him. I thought they were harmless. You deleted my reports. Thomas breathed heavily. I was in debt, Jerry. How much did he pay you? Thomas did not answer. Jerry understood. You knew. Not about contamination, I swear. Then testify. I can't. Families are drinking that water. You don't understand. Then explain it. Thomas's voice cracked. "Richard knows where my daughter lives." Jerry became silent. Thomas continued. "He told me accidents happen to people who suddenly develop consciences." Jerry felt his anger change into something colder. "Go to the authorities. I'm scared. So are those families. I'm sorry." The call ended. Jerry immediately wrote down everything he remembered. The following morning, he tried calling Thomas. No answer. By afternoon, Thomas's car was gone from his house. The cemetery office said he had not reported to work. 2 days later, Millstone police confirmed Thomas Keller had disappeared. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed he had fled because he was guilty. Others feared something had happened to him. Jerry knew only that the one man who could directly connect Richard Whitmore to the drainage modifications was gone. Without Thomas, the case remained difficult. But the state investigation continued. Testing confirmed contamination in groundwater beneath parts of Pinecrest. Whitmore Development blamed old industrial pollution unrelated to its construction. Richard appeared before cameras looking calm. "We purchased this land in good faith," he said. "If historic contamination exists, our company is as much a victim as these homeowners." Jerry watched from the cabin. Victim. The word made his jaw tighten. Several weeks later, the state joined affected homeowners in major civil proceedings against Whitmore Development and associated contractors. Attorneys collected engineering reports, environmental studies, and water samples. Yet one question remained difficult. How had contaminants supposedly removed before construction reached modern groundwater pathways and traveled toward residential wells? Rebecca was contacted as a consulting expert. During one meeting, lead attorney Sarah Bennett spread drainage maps across a conference table. "We can show contamination," Sarah said. "What we need is someone who can explain what happened to this site physically over time." Rebecca looked at the maps. Then she thought about Jerry. He had worked at Evergreen before major construction began. He had watched the ridge change. He had recorded the first abnormal runoff. He had seen the sediment before anyone understood its importance. He had studied the local geology. Most importantly, he understood how excavation around burial grounds altered soil because he had spent years physically working with disturbed earth. "I know someone," Rebecca said. Sarah looked hopeful. "Which university? None." Sarah frowned. "Consulting firm number government." Rebecca almost smiled. He was Evergreen Cemetery's Gravedigger. Sarah stared at her. "You're joking?" "I'm not." Across Millstone, Jerry knew nothing about the conversation. He was repairing a fence for $20 an hour when Rebecca called. "Can you come to my office tomorrow?" "What happened? The state's legal team needs help understanding the site." Jerry leaned against the fence post. "You can explain it better than I can. I can explain geology." Rebecca paused. "You can explain Evergreen." Jerry looked across the rural field. For months, the town had told him he was unqualified to ask questions. Richard had mocked his books. Thomas had told him to dig graves and remain silent. The cemetery board had fired him. Now professionals were asking for the knowledge Millstone had treated as worthless. Jerry felt no triumph, only responsibility. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I don't have a degree. I know, they'll use that against me, I know." "Then why me?" Rebecca answered without hesitation. "Because expertise begins with knowing something other people don't. And nobody has observed that ground as closely as you have." Jerry looked at his dirt-covered hands. Those hands had once prepared laboratory samples. They had held Linda's when she could no longer lift hers. They had dug graves. They had collected black sediment in a storm. Jerry had spent years believing each chapter of his life erased the one before it. Now, for the first time, he understood that they had been accumulating. Every loss, every job, every book, every hole he had dug, they had all brought him here. Jerry agreed to meet the attorneys. What he did not know was that Richard Whitmore would soon learn the same thing. The poor gravedigger he had tried to silence was no longer standing alone beside a cemetery. Jerry Reed was about to become part of the case against him. Sarah Bennett did not hide her disappointment when Jerry Reed entered the conference room. She had expected Dr. Rebecca Sullivan to bring another professor, perhaps an environmental engineer, or a consultant with decades of courtroom experience. Instead, Jerry arrived wearing an inexpensive gray jacket over a clean work shirt, carrying 2 battered notebooks and a cardboard file box. Sarah looked at Rebecca. "This is him. This is Jerry Reed." Jerry heard the doubt immediately. He had heard it before, at Maggie's diner, at Evergreen Cemetery, in Thomas Keller's office. He placed the box carefully on the conference table. Sarah folded her arms. "Dr. Sullivan tells me you have information about the Pinecrest site. I have observations. Professional observations." Jerry considered the question. "Documented observations." Sarah sighed. "Mr. Reed Whitmore's attorneys will attack every weakness we give them. If we put someone forward as an expert and they discover he has no degree, you don't have to put me forward as anything." Sarah stopped. Jerry opened his box. "I didn't come here for a title." He removed his first notebook. "I came because I was standing on that ground before Pinecrest changed it." The room became quieter. Jerry showed Sarah dated entries describing the first drainage alterations near Evergreen, then photographs, then weather records, then maps. He explained where runoff had previously traveled and how the pattern changed after construction trenches were cut. Sarah's skepticism slowly gave way to concentration. Jerry showed her the black-gray sediment photographed during the storm. He showed the maintenance report that later disappeared from Evergreen's files. Margaret's scanned copy proved it had existed. Then he explained the cemetery collapse. Sarah interrupted repeatedly. "How do you know that? What evidence supports this? Could there be another explanation?" Jerry never pretended certainty where none existed. Sometimes he answered, "I don't know." Sarah noticed. People trying to impress lawyers rarely admitted uncertainty so easily. Rebecca eventually placed an old geological map beside Jerry's records. Jerry identified discrepancies between the environmental report and known site geology. Sarah looked at him. Jerry explained the sandy subsoil descriptions, the clay and shale documented throughout Millstone Ridge, and the repeated laboratory values supposedly obtained from different sampling locations. When he finished, Sarah leaned back. "You found all of this?" "Some of it." Rebecca helped confirm what mattered. "And you learned the technical material yourself?" "Not entirely. I worked in a geology laboratory for almost 12 years. Sarah looked surprised. Rebecca smiled slightly. "You assumed shovel." Sarah ignored the remark. Over the next several weeks, the legal team reviewed Jerry's background carefully. Nothing could be exaggerated. Nothing could be invented. Rebecca conducted a formal competency review with him. She questioned him about stratigraphy, disturbed fill groundwater pathways, excavation patterns, erosion cemetery drainage, and limitations of field observation. When Jerry answered incorrectly, Rebecca corrected him. When he answered accurately, she pushed deeper. At the end of the process, she closed her notebook. "You understand what happens next. They try to tear me apart. That's one way to describe cross-examination." Jerry smiled faintly. Sarah explained that expert testimony did not depend solely on possessing a university degree. Specialized knowledge could also come from experience, training skill, and extensive familiarity with a particular subject. But qualifying Jerry would still be difficult. Whitmore's attorneys would argue that he was merely a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Jerry understood. Then Richard Whitmore learned Jerry might testify. The reaction was immediate. A man named Charles Avery approached Jerry outside a hardware store. Jerry recognized him as someone who occasionally handled property negotiations for Whitmore Development, Mr. Reed. Jerry kept walking. Charles followed. "Richard would like to resolve some misunderstandings." "There's nothing to resolve. Everybody has a number." Jerry stopped. Charles lowered his voice. $75,000. Jerry stared at him. "For what?" "You sign an agreement acknowledging that your observations at Evergreen were informal, and that you lack sufficient expertise to connect Pinecrest construction with the cemetery damage." Jerry almost admired the wording. Not silence. Not technically. Just a carefully purchased surrender. No, 100,000. Jerry's chest tightened. That amount could buy a modest house. It could erase debts. It could give him security he had not known since Linda became ill. For one dangerous second, Jerry imagined accepting. Then he remembered families carrying bottled water from homes they had believed were safe. He remembered the hospitalized child. No. Charles studied him. You're living in a hunting cabin. I know where I live. You're almost 60. I know my age, too. This could change the rest of your life. Jerry stepped closer. So could knowing I sold the truth. He walked away. 3 days later, Richard attacked publicly. Standing before reporters outside a county meeting, he called the investigation politically motivated. Then someone asked about Jerry. Richard laughed. So now the government's case depends on a bitter cemetery laborer with library books. The sentence spread rapidly. By evening, Jerry heard it on local television. At Maggie's diner, some people laughed again. Professor Graves had returned. But something had changed. Not everyone joined them. A Pinecrest mother named Allison Parker watched the interview while filling containers with bottled water for her 2 children. She did not see a joke. She saw a wealthy man mocking someone who might know why her family's water was contaminated. Other residents began asking the same question. If Jerry Reed was so irrelevant, why was Richard Whitmore working so hard to discredit him? The night before the qualification hearing, Jerry sat alone in his cabin. His dark suit hung from the door. It was the same suit he had worn to Linda's funeral. Jerry stared at it. For months he had imagined exposing what happened at Pinecrest. Now that the moment had arrived, he wanted to disappear. Court was different from a cemetery. In a cemetery, the ground did not laugh. Soil did not care about his income. Water did not ask whether he possessed a diploma. In court, people would. Richard's attorneys would discuss his failures publicly. His unfinished degree, his firing, his poverty. Maybe they would mention the cottage, maybe Philadelphia, maybe Linda. Jerry suddenly felt 58 years of insecurity gathering around him. He picked up his phone and called Sarah. I don't think I should do this. Sarah was silent. Before she could respond, headlights appeared outside. A car stopped beside the cabin. Jerry looked through the window. Rachel stepped out. He ended the call. When Jerry opened the door, his daughter was carrying a small envelope. I thought you might need this. Jerry recognized Linda's handwriting immediately. Rachel handed him the note. You kept it. You gave me a copy. I kept the original safe. Jerry unfolded it. Don't stop learning because life gets hard. His eyes remained on those words. Rachel touched his arm. Mom didn't care whether anyone called you an expert. Jerry swallowed. Neither do I. Then why are you afraid? Because tomorrow they get to decide whether what I know counts. Rachel shook her head. No. Tomorrow they decide whether they'll listen. Jerry looked at her. That isn't the same thing. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Jerry looked toward the dark suit. He finally understood. Richard Whitmore had spent months convincing Millstone that Jerry's worth depended on permission. Permission to ask questions, permission to study, permission to speak. Tomorrow Jerry would stop asking. The next morning he shaved carefully. He put on the dark suit. Rachel straightened his tie. Outside reporters were already gathering near the county courthouse. Jerry carried his notebooks under one arm. As he climbed the stone steps, he heard someone whisper behind him. Isn't that the gravedigger? Jerry did not turn. He continued upward. Behind the courthouse doors waited Richard Whitmore, his attorneys, the people who had mocked Jerry, and a judge who would decide whether a man without a degree could possess knowledge worth hearing. Jerry placed his hand on the courtroom door. Then he opened it. The courtroom was already full when Jerry Reed entered. Every bench seemed occupied. Pinecrest homeowners sat beside reporters. Members of the Evergreen Cemetery board occupied seats near the back. Several people Jerry recognized from Maggie's diner whispered among themselves. Margaret Collins sat near the aisle. Rachel was beside her. And at the defense table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, sat Richard Whitmore. Richard noticed Jerry immediately. A faint smile appeared on his face. Jerry knew that smile. It was the same one Richard had worn when he picked up Jerry's geology book at the diner. The same confidence, the same assumption that Jerry had wandered into a room where he did not belong. Jerry walked forward. Whispers followed him. That's him. The cemetery guy. Professor Graves. Jerry heard the nickname. This time he kept walking. Sarah Bennett approached and spoke quietly. Remember what we discussed. Don't try to sound impressive, just answer accurately. Jerry nodded. That I can do. The qualification hearing began. Sarah first called Dr. Rebecca Sullivan. Rebecca explained her academic background and described how she had reviewed Jerry's field notes, photographs, observations, laboratory experience, and continuing education. Then Jerry was called. He walked toward the witness stand. Rachel watched her father raise his hand and swear to tell the truth. She remembered the man who had sat beside Linda's hospital bed, exhausted and terrified. Now hundreds of eyes were fixed on him. Sarah began simply. Mr. Reed, did you graduate with a degree in geology, environmental science? Now Richard's attorney, William Prescott, smiled. Sarah continued. Did you attend college? Yes, part-time. I was studying environmental science. Why didn't you complete the degree? Jerry paused. My wife suffered a severe stroke. I left school to care for her. The courtroom became quieter. Sarah did not linger on the emotion. Instead, she established Jerry's nearly 12 years of laboratory work in a community college geology department. She asked about his responsibilities. Jerry described preparing samples, maintaining equipment, labeling geological materials, assisting with instructional laboratories, and handling soil and rock specimens. Then came Evergreen. How many graves did you help prepare or maintain during your employment? Jerry gave an estimate. What did that work teach you? That disturbed ground behaves differently from ground that hasn't been excavated. Sarah asked him to explain. Jerry did. He described differences in compaction settling moisture movement and the way replaced soil could respond to heavy rainfall. Some people in the gallery leaned forward. The man they remembered carrying a shovel was speaking with calm precision. Sarah moved to Jerry's independent studies: groundwater movement, stratigraphy, soil disturbance, erosion, forensic taphonomy. She introduced his continuing education records and Rebecca's documented supervision. Then, William Prescott stood. Your Honor, this is impressive personal study, perhaps, but Mr. Reed is not a licensed geologist, engineer, hydrologist, or environmental scientist. The judge looked toward Sarah. We are not offering Mr. Reed as any of those things, she replied. We are offering specialized, site-specific expertise concerning soil disturbance and burial ground drainage at Evergreen Cemetery, based upon his laboratory background, direct field experience, documented observations, training, and extensive study. The judge turned toward Jerry. Several technical questions followed. Jerry answered carefully. When he did not know something, he said so. William attempted to expand questions beyond Jerry's area of knowledge. Jerry refused to guess. I can't give you a reliable answer to that. Richard's smile weakened. The hearing continued for nearly an hour. Finally, the judge looked over the documents before him. The court finds Mr. Reed possesses sufficient specialized knowledge, practical experience training, and direct familiarity with the relevant site to assist the court within the limited area identified. Jerry stopped breathing for a moment. The witness may testify as an expert in site-specific soil disturbance and burial ground drainage analysis. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Something heavier. Jerry looked toward the gallery. One of the men who had laughed at him inside Maggie's diner stared at the floor. Margaret smiled. Rachel covered her mouth. Richard Whitmore did not move. Jerry had imagined this moment. He thought victory would feel like revenge. It did not. It felt like being allowed to finish a sentence interrupted years earlier. Sarah approached the evidence display. "Mr. Reed, I'd like to discuss the night of the storm." A photograph appeared on a large courtroom monitor. Jerry recognized it immediately. Black-gray sediment filled a drainage channel near Evergreen's northern boundary. Jerry explained where he had been standing and why he photographed the material. Another image appeared. Then another. He described the direction of runoff from Pinecrest. He explained how altered drainage routes increased water entering already disturbed cemetery soil. Sarah displayed maps comparing Evergreen before and after Pinecrest construction. Jerry showed how water had been redirected. William objected several times. Some objections were sustained. Jerry waited each time. He never argued. Then Sarah displayed Jerry's photograph of the exposed hillside. "What are we looking at?" Disturbed fill. "How can you tell?" Jerry pointed toward irregular layers and construction fragments. Natural soil generally develops recognizable horizons. This material contains mixed debris and inconsistent layers. Sarah showed the environmental report. "What does Whitmore Development describe at this location?" Jerry looked at the document. "Native sandy subsoil beneath clean fill." "And is that consistent with what you observed, Numby?" Richard leaned toward William and whispered something. Sarah continued. Then she reached the photograph Jerry had taken after the storm. It showed black sediment standing water and part of the construction boundary. Sarah enlarged it. "Mr. Reed, did you notice anything unusual in this photograph when you originally took it?" "Only the sediment." And later, Jerry looked toward Rebecca. She had helped him enhance and catalog details during evidence review. "Yes." Sarah enlarged the upper right portion. A small metal marker appeared near the disturbed slope. Numbers were stamped onto it. The courtroom seemed to lean toward the screen. "Can you read that?" Jerry did. "P17. Sarah placed another document on the display. "Whitmore Development's Environmental Sampling Report." She highlighted one entry. "Sample P17. According to the official report, soil from that exact sampling location had been tested before construction. The results described clean fill over uncontaminated material." Sarah looked at Jerry. "Where was marker P17 when you photographed it?" "Beside the drainage cut above Evergreen." "And what material was visible around it?" "The black-gray disturbed sediment." William stood. "Objection. The witness cannot determine chemical contamination from a photograph." Sustained. Sarah nodded. "Mr. Reed, are you claiming the photograph proves the material was chemically hazardous?" "No." "Then what does it prove?" Jerry looked at the image. "That the physical description in the report doesn't match what was visibly present at the marked location." The room went still. Sarah displayed the report again. P17 was described as clean sandy fill. Jerry's photograph showed irregular dark material mixed with debris. Then Sarah revealed another fact. The photograph's metadata established the date. It had been taken during the period when Whitmore Development's records claimed remediation at that location was complete. Richard's face changed. It was subtle. But Jerry saw it. For the first time since this began, Richard looked afraid. William stood quickly. "Mr. Reed, you have no way of knowing whether that marker had been moved." "That's correct." William smiled. "So your entire conclusion could be wrong." "It could." Several people murmured. William seemed pleased. Then Jerry continued. "That's why I checked the earlier photographs." Sarah looked at him. Jerry indicated another image. It had been taken weeks before the storm while he documented drainage changes. The same marker was visible. Same location, P17. William's smile disappeared. Jerry had not understood the significance when he took either photograph. He had simply documented what he saw. That habit had preserved something someone else had overlooked. Sarah placed both images beside the official environmental report. 3 records, 2 photographs, 1 contradiction. Richard stared at the screen. Jerry looked toward him. There was no satisfaction in Jerry's expression, only certainty. For months, Richard had relied on status money and paperwork. Jerry had relied on observation. Now the ground was beginning to speak. And the man Millstone once mocked for reading beneath a cemetery light was the one translating its story for the court. But Jerry knew the photograph was not enough. It opened the door. What waited behind that door could destroy Richard Whitmore, and the next witness might finally prove who had been hiding the truth. William Prescott approached Jerry Reed slowly. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed after the photographs of sampling marker P17 appeared on the screen. Richard Whitmore no longer looked amused, but his attorney was determined to regain control. "Mr. Reed, you were fired by Evergreen Cemetery, correct?" "Yes, for negligence." "That was the stated reason, and you disagreed with that decision, yes, so you were angry." Jerry considered the question. "I was hurt. Angry enough to investigate the people you blamed, I investigated what happened to the ground." Williams stepped closer. "You want this court to believe there is no revenge involved. I want the court to look at the evidence." William displayed Jerry's termination letter. "You lost your job?" "Yes, your housing." "Yes, your reputation." Jerry paused. "Yes." "And Mr. Whitmore publicly criticized you." "He did." William turned towards the courtroom. "Yet we are supposed to believe your testimony against him is completely objective?" Jerry looked at him. "You don't have to believe how I feel about Mr. Whitmore." William stopped. Jerry continued. "The measurements don't change because I'm angry. The photographs don't change because I lost my job. Water doesn't reverse direction because someone dislikes the person who documented it." Several people in the gallery shifted. William's expression tightened. "You enjoy sounding scientific, don't you?" Jerry recognized the insult immediately. It was Maggie's diner again, Professor Graves, but Jerry no longer needed to defend himself. "No," he said. "I enjoy being accurate." William changed tactics. He questioned Jerry about laboratory procedures outside his expertise. Jerry answered when he could and refused when he could not. "You don't know, no. You're the expert. In the area the judge qualified me to discuss." Richard whispered angrily to another attorney. William returned to the cemetery, collapse. "Isn't it possible improper excavation caused the damage it could cause localized instability?" "So, yes." "Yes." William smiled. "But that isn't consistent with what I documented." The smile vanished. Jerry explained that saturation had occurred across a broader area and aligned with altered drainage patterns from Pinecrest. William interrupted. "You cannot see underground, no. Then how can you know what happened beneath it?" Jerry looked toward the maps. "Because disturbed ground leaves evidence." He paused. "People can change paperwork, they can remove records, they can pressure witnesses, but the ground remembers what was done to it." Silence spread through the courtroom. William returned to his table. Sarah Bennett stood. "Your Honor, the state would like to introduce financial records obtained during the investigation." Bank statements appeared on the monitor. Several payments from Whitmore Development Associated accounts had been transferred to a business controlled by Thomas Keller. The dates matched critical stages of Pinecrest construction. Sarah explained that investigators had uncovered payments made around the same periods when drainage alterations crossed cemetery property. William immediately objected. "There is no evidence these payments were illegal. Mr. Keller is unavailable to explain them." Richard visibly relaxed. Thomas had disappeared. Without him, the defense could describe the transfers as legitimate consulting fees. Then the rear courtroom door opened. A murmur traveled through the gallery. Jerry turned. Thomas Keller stood beside two state investigators. Jerry stared at him. Thomas looked thinner, exhausted, ashamed, but alive. Richard's face drained of color. William rose. "What is this?" Sarah remained calm. "Mr. Keller contacted state authorities several weeks ago. Because investigators documented threats connected to his cooperation, his location was temporarily withheld." Jerry understood. Thomas had not simply run away. He had finally chosen to speak. Thomas took the witness stand later that afternoon. His hands trembled as he swore the oath. Sarah approached. "Did Richard Whitmore pay you, yes?" For what Thomas looked toward Richard, Richard stared back with cold fury. Thomas swallowed. To approve drainage access across cemetery property without bringing it before the full board. Why, Pinecrest had water problems. The approved drainage design was going to require additional engineering work and delays. What were you told to do? Allow temporary trenches to redirect runoff? Did Jerry Reed report concerns? Yes. Jerry lowered his eyes. Sarah continued. What happened to those reports? Thomas struggled to answer. I removed some of them. A wave of murmuring filled the courtroom. Why, Richard told me Jerry was becoming a problem. Richard leaned toward William, speaking urgently. Thomas continued. I destroyed originals. I didn't know Margaret Collins had copies. Jerry looked toward Margaret. She sat perfectly still. Sarah asked the question everyone was waiting for. Did Richard Whitmore know about potentially contaminated material beneath Pinecrest? Thomas hesitated. I heard him discussing remediation costs with one of his contractors. He said removing everything would destroy the project financially. William objected. The judge limited parts of the testimony, but the damage was done. Thomas had established concealment of drainage modifications and destruction of Jerry's records. Investigators now had enough information to focus excavation on locations identified through Jerry's analysis and historical maps. Several days later, the case returned to court with new evidence. Sarah stood before the judge. State investigators excavated a section near the former Sterling Metalworks property. Photographs appeared. Heavy machinery had removed layers of imported fill. Beneath them were corroded industrial barrels. Dozens. Some still carried faded markings associated with Sterling Metalworks. Laboratory testing confirmed hazardous residues in surrounding soil. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Jerry stared at the photographs. For months he had imagined what might be underground. Reality was worse. Richard's attorneys tried to argue that the barrels predated Whitmore Development's ownership. Sarah agreed. Then she presented construction records. Whitmore Development had commissioned preliminary testing years earlier. Internal documents showed indications of buried industrial waste before Pinecrest construction. Proper remediation would have cost millions. Instead, prosecutors alleged contaminated areas were covered with imported fill, while environmental documentation falsely indicated removal. The altered drainage system had compounded the danger. By redirecting groundwater through disturbed sections of the old industrial property, construction created new pathways for contamination. Those pathways moved toward Evergreen and portions of Pinecrest. The same drainage changes contributed to saturation beneath the cemetery's northern slope. The collapse blamed on Jerry had not resulted from careless grave excavation. It resulted from decisions made far above his pay grade, decisions hidden behind money and paperwork. Jerry was formally cleared of responsibility by the cemetery board shortly afterward. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded him. Jerry avoided most questions. Then someone called his name. He turned. 3 Millstone residents stood near the courthouse steps. One was a man who had laughed at him inside Maggie's diner. The man removed his cap. Jerry. Jerry waited. I owe you an apology. Another resident stepped forward. So do I. Jerry looked at their faces. Months earlier, he had imagined this moment differently. He thought apologies would feel like victory. Instead, they reminded him how deeply humiliation could remain inside a person long after laughter stopped. I appreciate you saying it, Jerry replied. The first man lowered his eyes. We treated you like you were stupid. Jerry was quiet. Then he said, You treated me like my job told you everything about me. The man nodded. Jerry accepted the apology, but he did not tell them it had never hurt. Forgiveness, he had learned, did not require lying about the wound. Across the courthouse plaza, officers accompanied Richard toward a waiting vehicle as the investigation expanded. For one brief moment, Richard and Jerry saw each other. Richard had once offered him money because he believed poverty determined Jerry's price. He had mocked his books because he believed education belonged only to people with credentials. He had destroyed records because he believed truth disappeared when paper disappeared. Jerry said nothing. He did not need to. Richard looked away first. Rachel approached her father. Margaret and Rebecca followed. Rachel slipped her arm through Jerry's. "You did it." Jerry shook his head. No. He looked toward the courthouse. "The evidence did." Rebecca smiled. "You had to recognize it." Jerry looked down at his hands. They were the same hands that had once carried a shovel through Evergreen Cemetery. Nothing about them had changed. What had changed was Jerry's understanding of their value. The town had finally learned what he was capable of. But more importantly, Jerry had learned it himself. The ground beneath Millstone had remembered everything people tried to hide. And when it finally revealed the truth, the poor gravedigger everyone dismissed had been the one prepared to listen. 8 months after Jerry Reed left the county courthouse, Pinecrest Estates no longer appeared in glossy advertisements promising a better future. State investigators surrounded sections of the development with temporary fencing. Environmental crews drilled monitoring wells throughout the former Sterling Metalworks property. Excavators slowly removed contaminated soil, while specialists traced the movement of polluted groundwater beneath the ridge. The cleanup would take years. Whitmore development collapsed much faster. Civil judgments, environmental penalties, lawsuits from homeowners, and the expanding criminal investigation destroyed the company Richard Whitmore had spent decades building. Richard faced prosecution for fraud, evidence tampering, environmental violations, and conspiracy connected to falsified reports. For Pinecrest families, justice was more complicated. Money could not erase months of fear. Still, settlements provided compensation, medical monitoring, temporary housing assistance, and financial support for families whose properties had lost value. For the first time, people were being protected instead of silenced. Evergreen Cemetery faced its own reckoning. One afternoon, Jerry received a formal letter from the cemetery board. They acknowledged that his warnings had been dismissed, that his records had been mishandled, and that he had been wrongfully blamed for the collapse. The board invited him to a private meeting. Jerry almost refused. Margaret convinced him otherwise. "You don't have to forgive them," she said, "but you deserve to hear what they have to say." Jerry attended. 3 board members sat across from him in the same office where he had once been suspended. The difference was almost painful. Before, Jerry had sat there defending his integrity. Now the men struggled to meet his eyes. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, Evergreen owes you an apology." Jerry remained silent. "We failed you." "Yes," Jerry said quietly. The blunt answer surprised them. The chairman continued, "We would like to offer you your former position back." Jerry looked at him. With increased salary and expanded responsibilities. For a moment, Jerry imagined returning. He remembered early mornings among the headstones. He remembered the quiet. He remembered Linda's note beneath the maintenance light. Evergreen had become part of his life. But it also represented the version of Jerry who once waited for other people to decide whether his observations mattered. "Thank you," he said. "But no." The chairman blinked. "You don't want time to consider? I've had enough time." Jerry stood. "I loved caring for that cemetery. I was never ashamed of digging graves." He looked around the room. "But I'm not coming back because you finally decided I'm worth more." Then he left. Outside, Jerry felt something he had not experienced in years. Freedom. Not financial freedom. Not yet. Something deeper. He no longer needed Millstone's approval to believe in himself. Dr. Rebecca Sullivan had already begun helping him explore another possibility. Jerry's old college credits had not disappeared. After reviewing his transcripts and recent continuing education, a Pennsylvania university admitted him into an adult degree completion program in environmental science. The first time Jerry received his student identification card, He stared at it longer than he wanted anyone to know. He was 59. Most students around him were young enough to be his children. Some were younger than Rachel. Jerry did not care. He attended lectures, completed laboratory assignments, studied groundwater contamination with knowledge that was no longer theoretical. He also began assisting Rebecca on field investigations. His unusual experience made him valuable. Jerry understood cemetery excavation. He understood disturbed soil. He understood how burial grounds changed over decades. And after Pinecrest, he understood how easily environmental evidence could be overlooked when people trusted documents more than land. Eventually, consulting work followed. One county hired him to help examine drainage problems threatening a historic cemetery. Another project involved identifying disturbed ground around an abandoned industrial property. Nobody called him Professor Graves anymore, but Jerry occasionally remembered the nickname. Strangely, it no longer hurt. 2 years passed. On a warm May morning, Jerry stood inside a university auditorium wearing a black graduation gown. He was 61. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the sleeves. Around him, younger graduates laughed, took photographs, and searched the audience for their families. Jerry searched too. He found Rachel first. She was waving. Beside her sat Margaret Collins. Rebecca was several seats away. Rachel's son, Caleb Older, now held up a handmade sign. Jerry laughed. Then his hand moved toward the inside pocket of his jacket. Linda's note was there. The original paper had softened along its folds. Don't stop learning because life gets hard. Jerry closed his eyes. For one impossible second, he imagined Linda sitting beside Rachel. He could almost hear her. You better finish. Jerry smiled through tears. When his name was called, he crossed the stage. Jerry Reed. Applause rose from the audience. Rachel stood. So did Margaret. Rebecca clapped until her hands hurt. Jerry accepted his diploma. Years earlier, he believed this piece of paper would prove he had become someone. Now he understood differently. The diploma did not create his worth. It honored a journey that had already revealed it. Several weeks after graduation, Jerry returned to Evergreen Cemetery alone. The evening was cool. He walked slowly between familiar rows of headstones until he reached a small memorial marker he had arranged for Linda after settling permanently in Millstone. He knelt. For a while he said nothing. Then he placed his fingertips against her name. I finished. His voice broke. Jerry laughed softly at himself. Took me long enough? Wind moved through the trees. Nearby, the old maintenance light flickered on automatically. Jerry looked toward it. That pale circle of light had once illuminated his loneliest nights. He remembered sitting beneath it with textbooks while townspeople laughed. He remembered Richard telling him that reading could never turn a shovel into a degree. Jerry stood. That was when he noticed someone near the maintenance shed. A young cemetery worker sat on the wooden bench with a textbook open across his knees. The young man saw Jerry approaching and quickly began closing it. Sorry, sir. Jerry stopped. For what? The worker looked embarrassed. I'm supposed to be on break. I've been studying. Jerry glanced at the book. Community college. The young man nodded. Nursing prerequisites? Good. The worker laughed nervously. Probably looks stupid, sitting in a cemetery trying to study biology. Jerry looked at the maintenance light. Memories rushed back. Maggie's diner, Professor Graves, the courtroom, Linda. He turned toward the young man. Never apologize for learning. The worker looked up. Jerry continued. And never let somebody else's idea of where you belong decide how far you're allowed to go. The young man slowly reopened his textbook. Jerry smiled and walked away. At Linda's memorial, he paused one last time. Millstone had once believed Jerry Reed was simply a poor gravedigger. The town saw dirty boots and overlooked the man wearing them. It saw a shovel and assumed it understood the hands holding it. It saw unfinished education and confused an interrupted journey with an incapable mind. But every grave Jerry dug had taught him something about disturbed earth. Every night beneath that cemetery light had sharpened his understanding. Every humiliation had tested whether he needed applause to continue. And every loss had forced him to discover what remained when titles, money, security, and approval disappeared. What remained was curiosity, integrity, persistence, and self-respect. Richard Whitmore had tried to bury the truth beneath imported soil, false reports, money, and intimidation. But some things refused to stay buried. The ground remembered. Jerry listened. And when justice finally needed someone to explain what the earth had been saying all along, the man everyone considered insignificant became the voice the courtroom could not ignore. Jerry walked toward the cemetery gate as the evening light faded behind him. He had entered Evergreen years earlier, believing his best life was already behind him. He left knowing something entirely different. A person's future does not end when others stop believing in him. Sometimes it begins the moment he stops needing them to.